Welcome to our deep dive into Japanese colonialism, specifically its impact on Indonesia.
Yeah,
You've chosen a pretty fascinating source for this deep dive.
right.
M.A. Aziz's book, Japan's Colonialism in Indonesia.
Great book.
And you know what makes it particularly interesting is that it was published in 1955,
Oh, wow.
just a few years after World War II.
So soon.
Talk about a fresh perspective.
Yeah, almost like firsthand, you know?
It's not just history, it's almost like
real time.
living memory.
Yeah.
And the book jumps right into this paradox
Wow.
that really struck me.
Okay.
Japan went to war, at least in part, to liberate Asia
Right.
from Western colonialism.
Uh-huh.
Yet,
Yet they were kind of,
they were playing the same game.
yeah, they were playing the same game.
Japan had been a colonial power for decades,
Decades, yeah.
mirroring a lot of the same tactics
Yeah.
used by the Europeans.
Right.
And Aziz doesn't shy away from this.
No, he doesn't.
He points to their actions in Formosa, now Taiwan and Korea, as prime examples.
Absolutely.
I was particularly struck by the details
Oh, yeah.
of how Japan tried to Japanize
Yeah.
the people of Formosa.
It's pretty intense.
Forced assimilation,
Yeah.
exploitation of resources,
Of course.
suppression of local culture.
Yeah.
It's all there.
Oh, the whole playbook.
You could see the parallels to European colonialism
Oh, absolutely.
very
That's
clear.
still clear.
So is this just a blind spot for Japan?
Well, you know,
Did they truly not see
yeah.
the contradiction in their own actions?
I think it's a little more complicated than that. Aziz argues that this hypocrisy actually reveals a fundamental flaw in their ideology.
Interesting.
Their Asia for the Asiatics slogan,
Right.
while appealing on the surface.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Sounds great, but it was ultimately a smokescreen
For their own
for their own ambitions.
imperial ambitions.
Precisely. It suggests that their motives were more about self-interest
Okay.
and regional dominance than, you know, genuine concern for Asian autonomy.
Right.
And this, Aziz argues, is what ultimately led to their downfall.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, it's kind of...
So by destroying European colonialism,
Right.
they inadvertently destroyed the very system
Yeah.
that allowed their own colonial empire to thrive.
Exactly. They were playing a dangerous game.
Yeah.
And in the end,
Uh-huh.
it backfired.
Spectacular.
Spectacularly, yeah.
And this brings us to Manchuria,
Okay.
or Manchukuo,
Right. Manchukuo.
as the Japanese called it.
Yeah.
The book uses this as a sort of case study,
Uh-huh.
a preview of Japan's grand plan
Okay.
for a co-prosperity sphere.
The famous co-prosperity sphere.
Right.
Well,
Manchukuo was a perfect example
I think so.
of how Japan operated.
Yeah.
They set up this puppet state,
Yeah.
claiming it was independent.
Oh, totally independent.
But in reality, it was completely under their control.
Completely.
They were calling for Asian self-sufficiency,
Right.
while simultaneously
We're all simultaneously.
exploiting Manchuria's resources
Exactly.
to fuel their own war machine.
You got it.
They established monopolies that pushed out foreign companies.
Yeah, no competition.
They took control of the education system
Got to control the narrative.
to quell any dissent,
Yeah.
and even manipulated the Manchurian currency
Wow.
to benefit themselves.
So it was all
It was very
self-serving.
self-serving.
Yeah.
So the co-prosperity sphere was really just code for
Yeah. What was it really code for?
prosperity for Japan.
I think that's a pretty good summation.
That's the argument Aziz is making.
Yeah.
And this pattern becomes even more evident
Okay.
when we look at Japan's actions in Indonesia,
Right, right.
which is, of course, what you're most interested in exploring.
That's why we're here.
Even before World War II, Japan had its sights set on the Dutch East Indies,
Right. Oh, yeah. Prime target.
those rich resources,
Unbelievable resources.
especially oil and rubber,
Already
just too
simply-
tempting to ignore.
I mean, who could resist that?
Right.
Especially with their ambitions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they saw an opportunity
Oh, yeah.
when the Netherlands was occupied
That perfect timing.
by Germany.
Yeah.
They started making demands
Uh-huh.
on the Dutch East Indies government,
Okay.
seemingly for economic cooperation.
Yeah. Just trying to help out.
But it sounds like these demands
Yeah.
were just a prelude to a takeover.
A prelude. Yeah. A smokescreen.
That's right.
Yeah.
Aziz reveals that these negotiations were largely
A charade.
a charade.
Totally a charade.
Japan was already planning
They
a military invasion,
already in the works.
regardless of how the Dutch responded.
Didn't matter.
They were just biding their time.
Biding their time.
Waiting for the right moment to strike.
Yeah, the perfect moment.
So they were setting the stage.
Setting the stage.
Creating a narrative.
Yeah.
That they tried to play nice.
We're the good guys.
But were forced to act aggressively.
Right. We had no choice.
Exactly.
Classic.
And when that moment came,
Yeah.
the Japanese invasion was swift.
Oh, yeah, they were.
And brutal.
They didn't mess around.
Shattering any illusion of liberation.
Liberation, yeah, right?
They might have initially presented.
That was the PR campaign.
And the way they structured their occupation.
Interesting.
It seems like they took what they learned in Manchukuo.
The testing ground.
And applied it to Indonesia.
Yeah. Took the playbook.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
The internment of Dutch civilians.
Yeah.
The establishment of a military administration that mirrored their Manchurian model.
Like a cookie cutter.
The use of censorship.
Got to control the information.
In propaganda.
Absolutely.
It's all there in Aziz's account.
It's all right there.
It seems like they were determined to control.
Determined to control.
Not just the land.
Right.
But the people as well.
Of course, the whole package.
They even went so far as to create
these
neighborhood associations.
Oh, yeah.
The Tanari Gumi?
The infamous Tanari Gumi.
What was their purpose?
Well, on the surface, they were presented as a way to foster community spirit.
Right.
Cooperation.
We're all in this together.
But in reality, it was much more about surveillance.
And control.
Yeah, keeping tabs on everybody.
It's a chilling reminder.
It is.
How these regimes operate.
Totalitarian regimes operate.
Yeah.
Using seemingly benign structures.
Right, under the guise of community.
To exert control and suppress any opposition.
Absolutely. Dissent was not tolerated.
And this control extended beyond the physical realm.
Into the minds.
Japan also recognized the power of religion, specifically Islam.
Powerful force.
In Indonesian society.
Absolutely. And unlike the Dutch,
right,
who had always been somewhat wary,
a little hesitant,
of Islam's potential for resistance.
Right. They saw it as a threat.
Japan decided to try.
They said.
And manipulate it.
Use it.
To their advantage.
Yeah. Co-opt it.
They established a dedicated religious affairs department.
Wow. A whole department.
They provided support to Islamic organizations.
Okay.
And even incorporated Islamic rhetoric.
Interesting.
Into their propaganda.
Yeah.
It was a calculated move.
It was.
To co-opt a powerful force.
Very strategic.
Within Indonesian society. And use it to further their own agenda.
Classic power move.
So beneath this veneer of Asia for the Asiatics,
this nice sounding slogan,
there was a much darker reality.
I think Aziz is making that argument pretty effectively.
That's the picture that emerges from Aziz's book. And as we delve deeper into their occupation, you'll see how this tension between rhetoric and reality, right words versus actions,
played out.
It's always about the actions.
In the economic, political, and social spheres of Indonesian life.
Right across the board.
This is already so fascinating.
It's a good one.
And I'm eager to hear more about how these contradictions ultimately contributed to Japan's downfall.
Yeah.
And paved the way for Indonesia's independence.
Can't wait.
Let's
keep going.
So we've been unpacking this whole idea. That Japan's liberation of Asia was more about self-interest.
Yeah, definitely.
Than altruism.
Oh.
More about them. And when we look at their economic policies in Indonesia, I think that becomes even more apparent.
Oh, absolutely.
It's clear from Aziz's account that Japan really saw Indonesia as a source of resources.
Basically a big supply depot.
To fuel their war machine.
Yeah, to keep things running.
They needed oil, rubber, rice.
Oh,
anything that could support their military operations. So how did they go about extracting these resources? Well, it's interesting.
Did they just come in and seize everything?
At first, they tried to keep up appearances.
Okay.
You know, they kept some of the Dutch administrative structures
in place.
But with Japanese overseers, of course.
To make sure that...
To ensure their control.
They were getting what they needed.
Exactly.
But it quickly became clear that this was just a temporary measure.
A stopgap, yeah.
You mentioned this concept earlier of a quasi-wartime economy.
Yeah.
That Japan was already implementing in Manchukuo.
Right. Their little experiment.
Can you explain what that means?
Sure.
And how it played out in Indonesia?
Basically, it meant restructuring the whole economy.
Wow.
To serve Japan's wartime needs.
So everything's geared towards the war effort.
Exactly.
So instead of producing rubber and tea for export.
Right, which is what they were used to.
Indonesian farmers were forced to grow what Japan needed.
Exactly. They needed to prioritize things like rice.
Okay, to feed the troops.
To feed the troops, yeah, and cotton.
For uniforms.
For uniforms, and even, they were growing plants.
Oh, wow.
To produce oil for lubrication.
Really?
Yeah, it was a total shift.
So everything's about keeping the war machine going.
Exactly.
But this had a devastating impact on the Indonesian people.
I mean, they were already under occupation.
Right.
Now their livelihoods are being disrupted.
They're being forced to grow things.
They don't want to grow.
That they can't even use.
Yeah, and they're facing shortages of essential goods.
So it's like a double whammy.
Absolutely, a recipe for resentment.
And this economic exploitation created a deep well of resentment.
I can imagine.
Among the Indonesians.
I mean, you have to remember, this is happening alongside the internment of Dutch civilians.
Yeah.
The strict censorship.
No freedom of speech.
And the general brutality of the Japanese military.
It's a powder keg.
Yeah, it's all contributing to this growing sense of anger and resistance.
Which brings us to
Indonesian nationalism.
A really fascinating aspect of this whole story.
It is.
How did Japan's occupation, despite its oppressive nature, actually end up strengthening the Indonesian independence movement?
It's one of the great ironies of history, isn't it?
It really is.
They came in claiming to liberate Asia from Western colonialism.
Right, Asia for the Asiatics.
But their actions just fueled the movement.
That would lead to their expulsion.
Yeah, they created their own worst enemy.
So how did this happen?
Well, for one,
what were the factors?
Removing the Dutch colonial administration.
Created a vacuum.
A power vacuum, yeah.
And the Japanese tried to fill that void.
They did.
But they also had to rely on Indonesians.
They had no choice.
To help administer the country.
Exactly. They needed local collaborators.
So for the first time, Indonesians were in positions of authority.
That they hadn't held before.
Wow.
They were involved in local governance.
Okay.
Managing resources.
Wow.
Even in the military. Through auxiliary units like the Hey-Ho.
So it's like they're getting a taste.
A taste of power.
Of self-governance.
Exactly, and that just fueled their desire for more.
For complete independence.
Exactly. They saw what was possible.
Aziz also talks about the impact of Japanese propaganda.
Yeah, the propaganda machine was in full swing.
They were constantly promoting this idea of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Right. We're all in this together.
And the need for Asian solidarity against the West.
Yeah, a common enemy.
Did that resonate with Indonesians?
It did, but
maybe not the way Japan intended.
Not quite.
Yeah.
I mean, many saw through the propaganda. They recognized Japan's self-serving motives.
Of course.
But the message of Asian self-determination and unity against colonial powers.
That's powerful.
That resonated deeply.
It gave a new impetus to the independence movement.
Absolutely, even if it was born out of resistance to Japanese rule.
Interesting.
Rather than alignment with it.
And let's not forget about education.
Oh yeah, education's key.
Aziz mentions how Japan completely overhauled
They did.
the Indonesian education system.
Yeah, they wiped out Dutch influence.
Erased it.
And introduced their own curriculum.
So what role did this play in shaping Indonesian nationalism?
It was a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
They wanted to instill their own ideology.
Of course.
Emphasizing Japanese language and culture.
Make them little Japanese citizens.
Yeah, but they also promoted this idea of Asian values.
Interesting.
And the need for Asia to forge its own destiny.
So in trying to indoctrinate Indonesians, they inadvertently exposed them to ideas that would later be used against them.
Exactly. They planted the seeds of their own destruction.
It's like they created the very tools.
I know, it's kind of poetic.
That would be used to dismantle their own colonial ambitions.
They did it to themselves.
And it goes beyond education.
Yeah.
Think about organizations like the Tonari Gumi.
Oh, yeah. Those neighborhood associations.
They were supposed to promote community spirit.
Right. Bring people together.
But they ended up being tools.
Tools of control.
Of surveillance and control.
Yeah, keeping tabs on everyone.
Did they have the intended effect?
Not really.
Or did they backfire as well?
I mean, they might have instilled some fear and compliance.
Sure.
But they also fostered a sense of unity.
Oh, interesting.
Among Indonesians.
Because now they have this shared experience.
Yeah, shared experience of resistance.
Even if it was subtle and underground.
Right? They had to be careful.
And then there's the Jawa Hukukai.
Oh, yeah.
This even more ambitious attempt
to
control all aspects.
Every aspect.
Of Indonesian life.
Total control.
Did that fare any better?
Not real.
It seems like another classic totalitarian tactic.
It is right out of the playbook.
Try to co-opt existing social structures.
Yeah, use what's already there.
And mold them to fit your ideology.
Exactly.
But Indonesians, for the most part, saw through it.
Yeah, they weren't fooled.
They recognized it as another layer of control.
Just another way to be controlled.
And continued to work towards independence in secret.
Yeah, they had to be discreet.
And we also can't forget about the Peattie.
The Peattie.
The Indonesian volunteer army that Japan created.
That's a head-scratcher.
What was the thinking behind that?
Well, like many of Japan's actions, it was probably a combination of factors.
Okay.
They needed more manpower.
Of course, as the war turned against them.
Right. They were getting desperate.
And creating an Indonesian army seemed like a convenient solution.
On the surface.
But it was a risky gamble.
Oh, yeah. Huge risk.
Because they were arming the very people.
Exactly.
Who could potentially turn against them.
It's like giving your enemy a weapon.
And that's precisely what happened.
It backfired spectacularly.
The Peattie provided military training.
Yeah. They got real-world experience.
And experience to Indonesian nationalists.
Who would later use those skills to fight for their independence.
It's like Japan essentially armed and trained their future adversaries.
They did it to themselves.
Another example.
Another one.
Of how their attempts to control and manipulate the Indonesian population.
Backfired spectacularly.
Yeah,
they really messed up.
This is all so fascinating.
It is.
It seems like every move Japan made.
Every single one.
Even those intended to solidify their control.
Yeah, they thought they were being so clever.
Ultimately contributed to their downfall.
Yeah, they outsmarted themselves.
And paved the way for Indonesia's independence.
Unintentionally, of course.
But how did this transition actually unfold?
That's the million-dollar question.
What were the final events
that
led to Indonesia breaking free from Japanese rule?
Well, that takes us to the final chapter of this story.
The climax.
Yeah, the dramatic events surrounding Indonesia's declaration of independence.
I can't wait to hear about it.
It's a good one.
We've seen how Japan's occupation, while brutal and exploitative, also kind of set the stage for Indonesian nationalism.
It's a strange twist, isn't it?
But I'm curious about those final months before independence.
Yeah, the end game.
What was happening as Japan's defeat became more and more certain?
Well, by 1945, the tide had definitely turned.
Against Japan?
Yeah, the Allies were advancing. Japan was on the defensive.
Did this shift in power dynamics affect their approach to Indonesia?
Oh, absolutely. You see this fascinating shift in their strategy.
Okay.
Almost desperate.
In what way?
Well, on one hand, they're trying to appease the Indonesians.
Okay.
Granting them more autonomy, allowing for these advisory councils, even hinting at eventual independence.
So it's like they're trying to win over the Indonesian people,
hoping
to maintain some level of influence even as their grip on power weakens.
Exactly. It was a gamble, a calculated gamble.
Hoping to prevent a full-blown rebellion.
Right.
And maybe even, secure some kind of alliance.
Yeah, keep them on their side.
As they're facing defeat.
Exactly.
But at the same time, they weren't exactly relinquishing control, were they?
No, not at all.
They were still tightly controlling resources.
Yeah, they needed those resources.
Yeah,
so that
ramping up their propaganda efforts.
Keep the message going.
And even creating new military units like the Peattie.
More soldiers.
It's almost like they were trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, trying to appease the Indonesians while still dominating them.
A risky strategy.
Very risky.
Did it work?
Not really. By August 1945, Japan's defeat was basically inevitable.
It was just a matter of time.
Yeah, the atomic bombs had been dropped.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Their surrender was imminent.
And that's when things get really interesting in Indonesia.
Yeah, things start moving quickly.
This is the moment, right?
The climax.
The culmination of years of struggle and resistance.
All those years of fighting for freedom.
And what happens?
What? Japan, in a last-ditch effort to salvage something from their crumbling empire, they decide to speed up the process of Indonesian independence.
So after years of oppression, they suddenly decide to grant Indonesia its freedom.
It's more complicated than that. Remember, they were facing defeat.
Right. Their options were limited.
They hastily formed this committee.
What committee?
The Preparatory Committee for Indonesian Independence, or PPKI.
PPKI.
In August 1945, just days before their official surrender.
And this is where Sukarno and Hatta...
Yeah, the leaders of the Indonesian nationalist movement.
They enter the scene.
They were appointed to this committee.
Okay.
likely with the hope that they would lead a newly independent Indonesia.
Okay.
That would be at least somewhat sympathetic to Japan.
Still trying to maintain some influence.
Yeah, but Sukarno and Hatta had their own plans.
They saw this as their opportunity, didn't they?
Absolutely.
The moment to seize control and declare Indonesia's independence on their own terms.
It was now or never.
And what did they do?
They seized the moment. With Japan's power fading and the Dutch still absent, they boldly declared Indonesia's independence.
When?
August 17, 1945.
Wow, just 2 days after Japan's surrender.
Talk about a power move.
A truly pivotal moment.
It changed everything.
I imagine this declaration was met with both jubilation and trepidation.
Definitely.
Jubilation for the long-awaited freedom.
Freedom at last.
But also trepidation for the challenges that lay ahead.
Yeah, the fight wasn't over.
They knew it was just the beginning.
Right. The Dutch weren't just going to disappear.
They had to secure their hard-won independence.
Long road ahead.
So in a way, Japan's occupation intended to serve their own imperial ambitions.
Yeah.
Inadvertently laid the groundwork for Indonesia's freedom.
It's strange how history works.
It's a fascinating example of how historical events can have unintended consequences.
Yeah, you never know how things will play out.
How oppression can breed resistance and ultimately lead to liberation.
The human spirit is powerful.
Aziz's book does such a great job of capturing these complexities.
He really does.
These intertwined threads of ambition and oppression and resistance.
It's all connected.
And ultimately the triumph of the human spirit.
That's what it's all about.
It's been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
I agree.
We've journeyed through Japan's paradoxical approach to colonialism.
Yeah, liberating Asia by colonizing it.
Their exploitative economic policies.
Taking what they needed.
And the unintended consequences that fueled Indonesian nationalism.
Yeah, they created their own downfall.
And we've witnessed the dramatic events that led to Indonesia's Declaration of Independence.
A moment that changed history.
Absolutely. As you continue to explore this topic, think about the lasting impact of this period.
Definitely.
How did Japan's occupation, with all its complexities and contradictions, shape Indonesia's national identity?
That's a big question.
And its relationship with Japan in the post-war era.
How do you move forward after something like that?
How did it influence Indonesia's political, social, and economic development?
It's all connected.
These are questions that continue to resonate today.
Yeah, the past shapes the present.
Thank you for joining us on this fascinating journey into a pivotal moment in history.
My pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Always keep learning. I